What's up, wizards? Welcome back to Across the Horizon, a collaborative project between Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology and Michael Beeson of Hacking Fate. I'm Michael Beeson of Hacking Fate, and with me is Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology. So we are jumping into Aphorism 22 of Ptolemy's Centiloquium. And yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead
I
and get
was
us
going to say,
started.
I was going to read Partridge. He says, neither cut out nor put on a new suit or garment, the moon being in Leo. And if she is there unfortunate, so much the worse.
All right, I will go for Coley. Coley's translation is neither cut out or first put on a new garment while the moon is in the sign of Leo. If she then be unfortunate, it is so much the worse. This aphorism smells of the superstitions of the Arabians and pertains to elections. Mr. Lilly saith, once casually, without inspection to the position of the moon, he put on a new suit. The moon being in Leo and ill dignified, and tore many holes in the suit, going a nutting. Within a fortnight after, nor did that suit ever do him any ervice, yet we must not be superstitious, but modest in our elections, only use them as natural helps.
Well, this is a good example of personally, I probably wouldn't elect a time to put on a new suit. That's not really on the other hand, it's possible to elect almost anything. So I got Ramsey out here, Astrology Restored. And so he says that you look at, says have regard to the ascendant and its lord, which makes sense, the person wearing it, the moon. Well, you almost always use that. The lord, the sign where the moon is in, and the fifth house, which is what he's using. That's pleasure, entertainment, I guess it's clothing or whatever. The fifth house and the lord, and let them be immovable signs, and let the moon, if possible, be in Aries, excepting the 7 degrees after the 8th. Wow. Or let her be in Cancer, except for the first 6 and last 3 degrees. I bet if you look through, it's probably like the Pitta degrees or Zemi degrees or something like that. I mean, he's going through and he's parsing out like little bits of it or terms. It could even be terms. I mean, you'd have to figure out what it was, but there's something negative about, so there's very specific degrees of, and so he says, fixed signs are to be shunned in putting on apparel. Don't have the fixed sign except for the first 20 degrees of Taurus, which may be use of this business. It being the house of the lesser fortune and exaltation of the moon. So Taurus is okay because it's a good sign or whatever. It says Leo of all fixed signs is to be refused, for it causes danger. Don't let the moon be in Leo, except it should be in sextile or trine of the sun with reception, and then is not to be feared so much. Interesting. It still doesn't say why. It just says it's problematic, the fixed signs. So movable signs are better, and there's all these so that's interesting. There's a lot of little picky little rules for like when you should be putting on new suits or new garments. So I suppose if you're a fashion, like I was saying, if you're a fashion designer, or you're like doing like if you were going to be a model or something, or you were, a debutante, I mean, I suppose you'd be like, this is really important. And, I mean, I wouldn't say for, that you couldn't be significant, but you can elect anything. I mean, I suppose that's what I'd come down to with this, is that you can pick a time and you can find rules for, that's what Ramsey's kind of amazing for, because I just thought, oh, I should open Ramsey and see what he has to say about that. So he goes on at length about the things. But again, why, that's really not laid out. I mean, you could probably figure out why the certain degrees of it were okay, but why the moon in Leo is problematic, it's a fixed sign. Okay. What is problematic about fixed signs as far as putting on clothes? It seems like it would last for a long time, right? I mean, durability, right? It seems like if you put in a movable sign, it wouldn't last very long. So I don't know what the logic is of the fixed sign versus the movable sign. So do you have anything to like to shed on that, on the actual electional thing there?
For that, I don't really. I mean, the only thing I can kind of come up with, and the fit signs really make sense because of lasting a long time when you don't have a lot of clothes. But at the same time, if you're courtly about it, then getting it in those movable signs makes a whole lot of sense because you want to be on the cutting edge of fashion. I don't know what to do for Leo. I mean, other than it's dangerous. Why is Leo dangerous? I'm not really sure in this. I mean, I could come up with some good answers, but it's really just conjecture if I throw those out there. And I don't know how relevant they are. And that would be things like, well, Leo is the house of the sun, so maybe it will be seen as you dressing above your station. But I can't really even, I can't say that with certainty. That's just a shot in the dark.
I should make some points here historically. It's like just to kind of explain this a little bit. You know, up until basically the 20th century, clothing was a pretty major expense for most people. You know, very expensive. I mean, everything has having to be sewn by hand, basically. And for a lot of people, it would have been made by tailors for you individually. And so, you know, clothing also would last a long time. You would wear it a long time, and you'd fix it and mend it and everything. I mean, the modern thing of just like tossing it out and wearing it once and quickly changing fashion. I mean, fashion changed, yeah, over 20 years, but you know, unless, like I said, you're the king, right? Yeah, I mean, you might wear a different suit every day or something like that. But even then, you know, you probably would get stuff renewed or, you know, change the jewels on it or something like that. So it actually would have been a much bigger deal to get a new suit, because it would have been a much bigger, much more expensive. It's more like getting a new car, right? So, but even so, like I said, we're still not getting very much light on what the basis of it is. But all right, fine. I wouldn't throw that out. If I really wanted to elect that, I would look at this and I would follow the rules that Ramsey sets forth. What I want to dive into now is Coley's sort of editorial comments here, which I think are really interesting. And they point up some interesting points about this 17th century astrology, that I've tended to call Renaissance. I mean, the English Renaissance was much later. I mean, Shakespeare's Renaissance, which is he's 1580s, whereas Renaissance in Italy would be like 1490, something like that. So it's a slower process, much later. So when you're getting to 1650 or so, 1640, it's really early modern. So one of the things that these astrologers were doing is, and we have to think about this, is that the astrology that they're practicing, is very much, still essentially medieval astrology of Guido Bonatti, that sort of thing. I mean, Guido Bonatti, you can see has incredible influence. Like if you look at Lilly's seventh house, you can see that in Christian astrology, it's very much Guido Bonatti. And then what Bonatti's practicing is essentially this Arabic astrology that came about in the 8th and 9th centuries, mostly by, you know, they're writing in Arabic. They're typically Syrian Christians or Jewish or Persian or whatever that invented this new synthesis. And what they did was to take Hellenistic astrology, Persian and Vedic astrology, and then create a new synthesis of it. And doing things like, for example, going from aspects being sign to sign to actually aspects by degree. So you can have separating and applying. And you have incredible techniques. You get pushing light, you know, transfer of virtue, all this incredible stuff. Very detailed, very complex, and very useful for making accurate predictions. So if you look at the back of Christian astrology, if you look at his bibliography, it's incredible. It's all basically Arabic authors, you know, that are the sources he points to. So, but what happened was, it's kind of a two-pronged thing. When we get to the 17th century, and even later, like you get to someone like Jean-Baptiste Morin in France, you get a lot of desire they start thinking, oh, you know what, we need to go back to the original astrology, the Ptolemaic astrology, and throw out these Arabic accretions. Well, the problem with that is that they're not doing Hellenistic astrology by any stretch of the imagination. There's a huge difference. What they're doing is Arabic astrology, and it's a different school, different techniques. But their belief was, oh no, this is all garbage. So in other words, everything we're doing, what they're not recognizing is that their technique, if you throw out the Arabic accretions, you don't really have anything left. That's what this astrology is. But that's sort of their bias. And like, oh, anything bad, we're going to throw it out. It was the Arabs that stuck that in there, and they messed up this, you know, pristine astrology of Ptolemy. And that's what we're going to try to go back to, even though that's basically a fantasy. Now, the other thing to talk about is a superstition. So that's something that they were getting increasingly concerned about. And superstition is, in a sense, almost a code word for anything spiritual. And so there's an increasing push towards stuff that's having a mechanistic explanation for it. And that's useful both from this rise of atheistic materialism and also from the fear that if you got spirits involved, that it was somehow black magic. And that's something they, even in this, you know, 17th century, they needed to be concerned about. I mean, if you're accused of, I mean, Lilly is interesting with talismans. I mean, you definitely was into astrological talismans, but he only mentions them in Christian astrology in Latin. I mean, there's a section on the 4th house where he's talking about getting rid of haunted houses like a ghost. And he says you can use spirits, but he mentions talisman, using talismans, but he switches into Latin. So this whole thing about the Arabic superstition, like I said, that's where this is all coming from. However, I do think there's a point here in saying, which is one of the things that I am kind of believe in, or what I follow, is that I don't elect every little thing that comes along. I have a little more faith in, you know, kind of the flow of events, or just sort of like karma or destiny or whatever. And I don't, every time I walk out the door, check to make sure it's okay. And I think what I think about it is that it's not necessarily wrong to elect the time to put on a new suit, but it kind of depends on what your motivation is. And I've noticed that, I call it the OCD school. People are freaked out. There's a lot of fear. And astrology can be used, like other superstitions, as a way to try to control that fear, you know. And the fears can be, like I said, step on a crack, break your mother's back. Why is that superstitious? Because it's just not, I mean, that's really a fear-based approach to it. So I think that while I'm not necessarily going to say that, you know, putting on a suit is coming out of superstition, I think it's a really interesting point, and one that's very topical for us today, because there's a lot of people out there that end up using astrology, I think, in a superstitious way. In other words, what they're doing is they're afraid, they have this sort of anxiety about things. They want to feel like they're in control, and they use astrology in such a way to feel like they're in control of the environment when maybe they're really not. And so I kind of like to have a little freer attitude about it and not be so worried about stuff. I don't think, for me, for example, if I want to do something really important, like I used to use, always elect the time to file lawsuits. But I mean, those are pretty important, you know. And if you could elect the time to buy a house or do something significant, I mean, why not? But at the same time, I think you want to be, if you can elect it, if it just doesn't work out that way, it's like, all right, that's just the way it goes. So I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff packed into this. And like I said, well, I wouldn't necessarily agree that it's superstitious to go ahead and elect this sort of stuff. I do think it's important not to use astrology in a superstitious way. In other words, to use it as a product of your fear, but to be confident, to say, let's maximize the potential here. Let's maximize the stuff. Let's be inspired by it, as opposed to a way of trying to control our fear or be freaked out.
I would completely agree with you. I mean, as to throw out the whole magician side of things, what the particular practice of magic that I practice is trying to do is bring you into more harmony with the universe. And it doesn't strike me as very harmonious if every time you try to make a decision, you're asking, oh, wait, is this decision in harmony with the universe? It's totally breaking the flow. So I get electing really big, important things, but even then, I look at astrology as really useful for prediction, and I look to it to help me work with things like talismans to better understand how these forces work and to better understand who I am and my place in the broader picture instead of trying to control it. I think that that's making an idol of it.
Yeah, I think
If you're trying to control everything.
yeah, I think it's really like, it's just interesting to think about, well, what are my motivations here? Am I doing this because I'm afraid? Am I doing this because I'm freaked out? Or it's like, no, I just want to maximize, you know, and again, I mean, there's a certain level of, okay, I want to make sure this comes out right. So it's like, I'm not going to say that I have no zero. And the other thing about being superstitious is I'm totally superstitious. I mean, I don't like the number 13 at all. You know, if I'm numbering things, I'll like skip 13. You know, on the other hand, if I was driving all night, I was exhausted, I had to rest, I come to the hotel and all they have left for me is room 13, I'm going to take that. Because I, you know, it's at a certain point, I'm not going to let the superstition interfere with things that need to get done. At the same time, it's perfectly fine. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying I have a preference. I don't like the number 13. I don't particularly like it. The problem that comes with this, you start taking it too seriously, right? And start messing and letting that fear rule your life and letting things control you with it. So I think that comes up in astrology. And I think that there's certainly a desire to control, or to, like, say, oh, that's Mercury retrograde. And I'm like, yeah, maybe it is, or maybe it isn't. And I think that there's Mercury retrograde, for example, is something I do think that's used superstitiously, because we just don't know what's going to happen. You know, say, oh, Mercury retrograde is bad. It's like, what's going to happen? Well, I don't know, but something bad. It's like, well, that's not astrology anymore. That's turned into a superstition, which is fine. Like I said, if you don't want to do stuff in a Mercury retrograde, that's your choice. I'm not going to, because I'm superstitious myself. The problem is that it turns into, it's wrong to be superstitious, and then what's going to raise everything to, oh, it's actually, oh, it's totally logical, it's rational, it's astrological. So lots of interesting issues with this. The superstition is one that we could probably talk about and chew over endlessly, but I think it's interesting that he raises that. I sort of half agree with him and half don't. Like I said, if it's important for you to do a, you know, like I said, you're a fashion designer, or, you know, this is a brand new thing, or you want to look good, you know, maybe it would be important enough to you to elect the time. So I don't have a problem with it. And I do think everything can be elected. You know what I mean? Everything is in tune, you know, with the potentially with the heavens. And just, so that's what I liked your point about orientation, is like, really, why not take advantage of the flow, go with the, you know, things that, you know, like when you hit that timing where every light is green, I mean, why not? I mean, I think that's the closest. On the other hand, hey, if it's red light, doesn't mean I'm going to turn around and go home because I'm too freaked out that there's a red light on my first. I hit 2 red lights. Oh no, I got to go home. It's too dangerous. So lots of interesting issues with this, and that's what's great about aphorisms. They pack a tremendous amount of information and theory and practice into a very short thing, and that's why it's so much fun to go through and discuss these.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and throw out one more thing.
Sure.
I think that is the most fun and interesting to elect something if you're not really sure when you're gonna do it. It's like, oh well, next week sometime I'm going to be doing this thing, and I could do it this day, or this day, and then you just which day is the most harmonious. Still, that to me seems like a more interesting way of doing it, and you're not making yourself a slave to the astrology that way.
Well, you know what I get a lot is people will be like, you know, I've decided on this and such a date for my wedding, and I want you to check it and tell me it's a good date astrologically. I'm like, chances are it's not. You know, chances are that the methods I'm using are not the same as they're using. And if you want to find, typically with an election, the better way to do it is to say, okay, you've got the next 90 days, for example, and 24/7. You know, it's also difficult if someone comes in and says, well, it has to be between 8 and 3 p.m. Monday through Friday in the next week. I'm like, that's a very small universal stuff we can look at. You're knocked out a lot of stuff. So hopefully what you do, you don't do it backwards, which is to start with the date and tell me it's good. What you better way to do it would be to say, okay, we can do any time. Now, the problem with it using astrology is you got to basically go with the astrology. If it says 3 o'clock in the morning, well, then that's the time you have to get up and do whatever you're going to do. And I do that. I mean, so far, knock on wood, I haven't missed any talisman elections, you know. But I do that. People, I mean, for example, when you get a talisman from me, you get a free, if it's a fixed star talisman, you get a free consecration election. And people say, oh, I missed the election. I'm like, well, you could buy another one then, you know, because it's just one of those things that you really have to devote yourself to it. And that's why it's a little frustrating, you know, sometimes, you know, people, like I said, with the weddings, those are some of the hardest ones to do because you've got so much to coordinate. It may not even be possible to do that, but that's fine. I mean, you know, people don't necessarily, and people have perfectly great weddings and marriages and everything, even though the elected time for the marriage wasn't necessarily perfect or wasn't elected. I mean, people do it all the time. So it's not, I think the thing about elections for a lot of people is that a lot of times people are not willing to do the magic, but the election is sort of the way they do the magic in their mind. And so in their view, the election is like super important. I mean, and if you get a good election, you can do anything. But if you have a bad election, then it'll just, your head will explode. And so it takes on this huge importance when in fact, you've got multiple cycles of fate. And you've got, you know, your personal chart, you've got your family, you've got the other, for a wedding, you got the other person and their family, you've got the economy, the nation, all this stuff's going on. The election is just one of those cycles. So it's nice to hit it. But again, there's a lot of other things going on, and there's plenty of stuff that's not astrologically determined. I think the astrology is only getting a narrow band of stuff that's going on. It's not unusual to have stuff not conform to the chart. I mean, that happens from time to time because there's other cycles, other things that are going on. It doesn't invalidate the astrology, but it also means it's not all inclusive. So lots of interesting things to keep. I think it's the best thing to keep fun, keep interesting, use it for inspiration, elect it if you can, but don't worry about it if you can't.
Good rules to live by. Well, we will catch all of y'all next week.